Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry I'm running a tad behind schedule this morning. I had a meeting with some folks about whales, surprisingly. I mean, hard to believe I was talking about right whales. So I want to welcome everybody to the annual meetings executive committee meeting. I'm going to call this meeting to order. The first item of business this morning is the approval of the agenda. Does anybody have any additions to the agenda? I'm not seeing any hands. So we'll move on to approval of the meeting summary from August 2021. Does anybody have any additions, deletions, corrections to the meeting summary? Seeing no hands, we will deem it approved by consent. Next item is public comment. Is there any member of the public that would like to make a comment regarding anything that is not on the agenda? Again, I'm seeing no hands. So with that, we're going to move right along to the review and consider the approval of the FY 2021 audit. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my vice chair, Spud Woodward. Spud?
Thank you, Pat, and good morning, everybody. The Administrative Oversight Committee met on October 7th virtually, and we reviewed the financial documents provided to us by the firm of Dixon Hughes Goodman LLP. Those documents you should have received via email last week. We discussed the findings, and not surprisingly, it was a clean audit. There were no issues of concern. We had a good discussion about the financial processes of the commission, and ultimately a motion was made and seconded and approved. And so I'll bring that motion forward to the executive committee that it accept and approve the financial statements and audits for FY 2021. And myself or Laura will certainly be glad to entertain any questions.
If you need a motion, I'll make it, Dennis. Move that we approve the fiscal year 2021 audit.
All right, Mr. Chair, I'll leave it to you to manage that.
Pat, I think you might be on mute.
Yeah.
Oh, I am on mute. Thank you very much. Do we have a second for the motion by Dennis Abbott to approve the 2021 audit?
Pat, I saw Roy's hand go up first, but then you have a lot of other people who are willing to speak.
Okay, I'm not seeing the hands here, Tina. I may be. Oh, there we go. Now I'm all set. So second by, we have a motion by Dennis Abbott, seconded by Roy Miller to approve the 2021 audit. Are there any questions or comments on the audit or on the motion? Roy, your hand is still up. Do you have a comment?
No comment. Thanks.
No comment. Is there any objection to the motion? Hearing no objection, the motion passes. Thank you very much. Spud, does that conclude your report?
I may mention that there has been some interest in the Commission's investment policy, and we're continuing to work on that. We also discussed that during our ALC meeting, and Bob and Laura are working on continuing to update those guidelines to reflect the current operational practices of the finances of the Commission. So at some point in the future, maybe the next executive committee meeting in January, we'll bring that forward to the executive committee as well. But that's all my business for the AOC.
Great, thank you, Spud. I'm seeing no hands, so we are going to move right along on the agenda. The next item is to discuss a policy on responding to FOIA requests. And Bob has brought this up quickly at some prior executive committee meeting. Obviously, since we don't fall under either a state or a federal FOIA law, there's been some consideration on how we may be able to react if we do get these type of requests to ensure transparency. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our director, Bob Beal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. Everyone should have received, or on supplemental material, there's a short one-pager, sort of a draft, either policy or guideline on information requests. That tells you kind of the maturity of this document. I'm not sure if we should call it a policy or guideline at this point, but I've been working on it a little bit with our attorney and trying to keep it kind of short and sweet, but provide some guidance to the public, as well as provide some flexibility to the commission on interpreting exactly what can and can't be released to the public. As the chair said, we're not subject to state and federal FOIA laws, so we're kind of stuck in this middle ground where we want to be transparent. We make every effort to be transparent in our meeting processes and record keeping and everything else that we do. Excuse me, but we don't have guidance from a law that helps us decide what we can and are not required to release to the public. So the document pretty quickly goes through the background of the commission and describes, our processes, and notes that many of our things are captured in the guiding documents of the commission, the compact and rules and regulations and charter and technical committee and guidance, stock assessment process, and other things. And then the document goes on to note that a lot of the information people request is actually just available on our website: meeting proceedings, technical documents, stock assessment information, and those sorts of things. So a lot of times when we do get information requests, it just ends up Tina sending them a link from the website, and away we go. So those are kind of easy, and we handle those very quickly and no problem at all. But the question becomes, what about things that aren't on the website that are kind of not quite confidential but sensitive, let's call them? How do we handle those sorts of things? So the document kind of goes on to say, all right, if you want something you can't find on the website, send an email to info@asmfc.org. We'll get back to you and acknowledge that we have that within 14 days, and tell you a timeline of when you can expect a full response for your request. The document then, in the second to last paragraph, notes that ASMFC, like all other governmental entities, have things that we can't release. There's confidential data. And confidential fisheries data is something we talk about all the time. The way we have handled, and I suggest we continue handling confidential data requests, are essentially bouncing those requests back to the entity that originally collected that data. So if it's data collected by a state or data collected by the federal government, we essentially transfer that FOIA request to them. Just because data comes to ASMFC through an annual compliance report or through ACCSP or any other method, it doesn't change the confidentiality of that data. It's still confidential. We still can't release it, but we want to go back to the original entity that collected that data and let them decide what can and can't be released, just to make sure that we don't violate any state confidentiality law. Because everyone, most of us are governed by the rule of three. But there are some nuances at the different state level, the 15 states as well as the federal agency. So rather than ASMFC staff trying to interpret all those different policies at the state level, we've decided when we have been going back to the original agency and asking them to provide the data that is allowed to be provided. And then in the final paragraph, it just talks about some other things that we can't provide to the public, and such as deliberative information, pre-decisional technical and policy documents, attorney-client privilege documents, personnel and personal information. Those are pretty standard things that FOIAs allow agencies to protect and not share with the public. The final products are obviously available, and we'll make those available. But some some deliberations. For example, if we're going through an RFP process and there's internal deliberations back and forth on different merits of projects, and we're ranking projects and that sort of thing, a lot of those deliberations really aren't made available by the federal government or many of the state entities. We provide anyone a review of their RFP and what the reviewer said, but we generally don't provide all the scoring for the other RFPs and that sort of thing. That's just an example. So that's a quick document. Again, trying to keep it short and sweet. There's two things that aren't in here that could be added. One is sort of the length of time that documents will be retained at ASMSC. There's different provisions in different state and federal laws on how long documents must be retained. And then the second thing that we could include in here is sort of expectations for anyone that sends correspondence to ASMSC, sort of a note that says, if you send an email and or a letter to staff at the commission or commissioners that goes through our office, those have the potential to become publicly available documents, and we may share those upon request from the public. So, Mr. Chair, that's a quick summary of where we are. Again, as you said, we've talked about this very briefly at other meetings. It's the first time everyone's seeing this document, so it's up to the group. We can take some guidance on updating this and bring it back at another meeting. If folks think it is close to being ready to go, we can go ahead and approve it. It's really up to the group. There's no urgency here other than this would be nice to have just so we can control the expectations of the public.
Great, thanks, Bob. Before I ask for comments on the document, I've got three of my own. When I was reviewing this the other day, some things that stood out to me compared to the law that I have to deal with here in the state of Maine. Upon receipt of any request here, we have what we call a 5-day letter. And I know that you're talking about within 14 days, ASMSC will acknowledge the receipt of the request. 14 days may be too long. Just a simple letter that says we have received your request. We may want to shorten that time frame. The other component we may want to consider is the fact that some of these requests are likely going to be extremely large, and we ought to reserve the right to charge for that information if they are large. We quite often here with the FOIA request, we'll charge an entity if I've got, if it takes a couple hours, that's one thing. But if it's going to take a couple days, then we do try to recoup some of our costs. And we never recoup it all. It's a very low level, but it does allow for that. And then lastly, what's not here is that gray area of if it's confidential or if it's not. I'm wondering if we need this document to spell out the process by which staff would come to a small group, and maybe it's just the chair and vice chair, to make a determination on whether the information would be released. So those are my thoughts after reviewing it. But I think it's a really good document and it's a great start. So with that, I'll take some hands here. The first hand is Jim Gilmore. Go ahead, Jim. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Actually, and Pat, I had some of the same questions. So the 5-day letter, and it's a good point. We have the same requirement under our FOIA, and one way we get around it, however, is our law says we have to respond. So a lot of times we say we've gotten a response, but we'll get back to you when we get the information, which could be weeks or months even. So, and charging is a good idea because it gets to that next point of you get those requests that say we want a copy of everything that's happened up until now, back to the dawn of time, and of course that could be truckloads of info. So that tends to reduce those frivolous requests. Lastly, just a question, and my agency, and I'm sure a lot of them, we have actually a FOIA officer. So anytime we get a request, the different divisions would do the, get the information together, but it goes to that one point person, which in our agency is an attorney. So just a question, I guess we'd have to, do we have somebody officially, or do we want to do that? Because again, there are legal implications to what we're doing. So plus we don't have a staff attorney, so something to just think about. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Those are all good points. It sounds like y'all are and my law are pretty similar, as well as the process. Bob, do you have any response to that?
Yeah, on Jim's last point, I think essentially I've been the filter. If there is a request and there's some things that are uncertain whether we can or can't provide those, I've been acting as a filter. And if we get to the point where I need to consult with Sean Donahue, our attorney, I do that. So all the big ones have been going through me. If it's if it's something simple and somebody just wants something that as I said earlier, maybe Tina can provide them a link from the website, that's a no-brainer. But if there's anything in a gray area, those have all been run through me.
Yeah. Okay, great. Next on the list is Erica Burgess. Erica, you may be up. You're off mute now.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have the joy of overseeing public records for our division at FWC. It's a great job. So I could offer a few points of consideration. I would recommend the commission adopt a disposition schedule for records, and that way you can clearly track the destruction of records as you move forward, and it can save staff time in the long run depending on the records request. I'd also encourage, as was mentioned, to have a statement about charging for certain documents. We have a policy, be happy to share our agency's policy with ASMFC about what rates we charge, when we charge, how much we charge, etc. And we develop an invoice for each public record, and the invoice is reviewed, and then the applicant can either accept and pay the invoice or not. It's up to them. And then lastly, I'd also recommend, shoot, it left my mind. I'll raise my hand again if I think of the other point, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Thanks, Erica. Bill Anderson.
Good morning, Pat. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Just a couple of items, Pat, and some of it is just piling on from some of the previous comments. First, Bob did mention a couple of suggested adds to his this document. They both sound pretty good to me, and I would suggest, at least from my perspective, that they be added. Your point, Pat, on the 5-day response or a response shorter than 2 weeks, I think does deserve some consideration. In my experience, I've seen everything from 48 hours to 4 or 5 days. I think that's a reasonable response time, simply to acknowledge the receipt of a inquiry and a commitment as to when a response might be forthcoming. Very short, but I think that's important to your point. And on the reimbursement part, that's a must-do in my mind if it's more than just a couple of hours or a handover to a state to deal with it. And I know, Pat, you mentioned main charge is a relatively low amount. I would submit that because the money that comes into ASMFC is tight and is critical for our mission, that if reimbursement for a significant, and some of these are time consuming, as you all know, FOIA data search and response, I'd say we make sure that LORG uses fully loaded cost for any of those things to make sure that money that we should be spending on other things is fully available for those other important projects. Thanks, Pat, I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Bill. I appreciate those comments. Dan McKernan.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. Just to give my perspective here, the old days, the cost that an agency could charge the individual was typically the labor of an employee going through paper files and then photocopying, and then so there was the cost of what was typically the least paid employee plus the copying costs. But today, since most documents are electronic, it's fairly easy to do record searches and come up with the documents a lot faster. The problem becomes the need for inspection. In our case, it's usually by our attorneys to examine all of the records to make sure that we're not giving information out that is, as Bob mentioned, confidential or, sensitive or, deliberative or personal. So that's a new kind of cost. I think when at the beginning of a lot of our careers, it was different, but I agree with that. And as far as reimbursement, that I think it's critical. We've had some fishing expedition, I would call them, public records requests, and we've gone back to them after we've estimated the cost. Once we've seen the number of records that would have to be reviewed, and they've narrowed that. The petitioner or the requester appropriately narrows the search terms or the time period, and that helps a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That's a really good point. That is certainly something that we've seen here when we start talking about how we're going to invoice based on the time. And I would say 90% of the time that actually does narrow the search to ease the burden back on staff and still give the information that was really needed at the end of the day. Erica, I see your hands back up.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I remember the third point I wanted to make. I believe it might be wise, but I'll leave it up to the committee to discuss, that this policy also include a statement about ASMSC will not create a record. So if a record doesn't already exist, it should be clearly stated that it wouldn't be upon the commission to create a record to respond to an information request. A lot of our records requests are under that category, and so then we are able to quickly dispel them. We work to provide the information we have, but it would take a significant amount of time sometimes to develop the records that people want.
Yeah, that's another excellent point, Erica. Thank you for bringing that forward. That's certainly something that we've seen here as well. I'm sure we all have. I don't see any other hands. Bob, does that give you some good guidance to do some rewrites, and we can take it up at one of our interim executive committee meetings?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great. And, this policy, as we started it, it's a balance of, detail versus, how much detail do we want in here? We want to sort of describe every potential scenario, or do we want to keep it broad? I mean, many of the things that are suggested to add this morning are still pretty broad. So I think I've got everything I need to make it a better document. We can bring it back, and I think we're probably end up in pretty good shape. And I guess the really fundamental question, is this a policy or is it a guideline? Is this something we kind of use, or is it something that really is binding to the way we do business? And I think adding some of the additional information that folks have requested today, it sounds like we're heading more toward the policy type document, which is fine. I just wanted to sort of feel out the group and see if they wanted this to just kind of be a sense of what goes on, just to give the public an idea, or if we really want to cover a fair amount of detail. And it seems like the latter is where we're going, which is great.
Yeah, why don't we do this if there's no objection? I see another couple hands come up. Let me come back around to those hands. But what we could do is on the next review of the draft, tackle that question. But I know I certainly would lean on the direction of a policy, but we can come back to that. Mel Bell, your hands up.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's what I was going to say. I think given that you want to make sure you treat every request in the same fashion, policy probably makes more sense than guideline, just for consistency across the board when you get into these.
Great, thanks, Mel. Erica, your hand's still up. Did you have one last comment? Nope. Hands down. Thank you. All right. Well, I think we've got enough. Let's tackle this at the next executive committee meeting. We can review the draft and we can make a final decision on policy or not, and we'll go from that direction. Really good discussion on that point, on all those points. So let's move right along with the agenda. The next item is to discuss the commission involvement in wind energy development, and we have had some preliminary involvement, but I know Joe has some additional thoughts. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Joe Semino.
Yeah, thanks, Pat, and thanks to the committee for humoring me here. But I know a lot of you, I see your faces at quite a few wind meetings. So as Pat mentioned, we've had conversations about this and the commission's role, but things are progressing along we're at a place we have never been, getting real close to construction and dealing with a lot of EISs already. So, there's a couple fronts that I think ASMFC's involvement may be important in the future. There's a lot of discussions about research and having regional coordination for that research. Also, where the data that is collected during research and monitoring is going to be stored. We're having those conversations with Rosa, but there's a lot of expertise in-house. ACCSP has been doing it for a long time. I think a lot of Jeff and Julie, it'd be interesting to have maybe their perspective on some of these meetings when we're talking about data standardization and data sharing, data storage. And there are other important conversations that are getting started, but really need to be further along probably than they are, like compensatory mitigation, and can we take a regional approach to that? Some of the states are trying to have those discussions, both just as interstate conversations, but also with BOEM and other federal agencies. And again, it becomes a question of, is there a role for the commission? So I'm not here petitioning, Pat. I'm just here to kind of get the temperature, so to speak, again, of, is this something, the executive committee is interested in? Is this that we should be discussing again at policy board? Because I think in the very near future, someone's going to have to step up and help with regional coordination, because these projects are moving along quickly enough that if you're going to have baseline data, people got to be out there very soon. And that's going to mean that data is going to be collected soon. And if we're going to have compensation conversations, they need to happen very soon as well. So that's all I had. And I'm just curious if we could, have a little discussion here. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Certainly offshore wind is, as you made note of, is advancing. President Biden's just recently made some comments about the timeline for the Gulf of Maine. So, and we're very much in it here in the state of Maine with the governor's initiative for a research array of up to a dozen turbines. And the state actually filed an application here for that process. So a lot happening, a lot of moving parts. I've had concerns about mission creep here, but you can't, some of this stuff we just cannot avoid. So why don't I open it up for comments and discussion here, and to see if we want to have a broader conversation at the policy board level. Any hands? Jim Gilmore.
Thank you, Chairman. I think between New Jersey and New York, I think we're the future of Windmill Alley, the amount of towers they got planned out there. I hear you, Joe. I think we really, the data would be something I think of interest to the commission, but we need to be very careful, because I think several of us have been sucked into the void of offshore wind and staffing commitments to it, whatever. And Pat's point about mission creep, we really don't want to get involved with mediating. They're all talking about compensatory plans and all this other stuff. And we have a separate agency called NYSERDA that's supposed to be taking care of that, but they're not doing a very good job. So we have our own coordination issues within the state, and then you start talking about the other neighboring states. So I think I definitely would support that. We could, the data would be beneficial to the commission, but beyond that, I think we would need to be very careful not to get, sucked into like now becoming involved with decisions and mediation and all other stuff. So thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jim, for those comments. Bill Anderson.
Thank you, Pat. I realize that the concern about mission creep is always an important one. And I think Joe used the term coordination or something through ASMFC. I certainly wouldn't be one promoting a lot of staff time to be involved in this, but And we are a little different maybe at Maryland DNR than some of the other organizations because our energy research program is part of my team. The coastal zone management people that are involved with wind energy, part of my team. So we have a chance to coordinate a little bit better at Maryland here. But there are issues that I think my team is saying are coast-wide. And NOAA, I'm sorry, BOEM, I apologize, is kind of picking off state by state. And I think it is very important for us to be able to, as a coast, share ideas, have a consistent single message where it's appropriate to BOEM. And I know this is outside the territory that ASMFC is responsible for, but maybe the only organization that gets all of our fisheries teams together as one organization. And I think that would be valuable in terms of developing that single voice and sharing ideas. There is some value there, Pat. So thanks.
Thanks, Bill. I've got two more hands coming up, Jason McNamee and then Eric Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe having Eric go first, that might have been good, but I'll try to get to the point here. So I'll sort of put myself more in the camp of Bill. I think, I mean, this is an existential, not to be hyperbolic, but this is a big deal. This is going to be a fundamental change to the things that we do, and we need to stay relevant in these discussions. I totally get what Jim said about, you know, the sort of burden that this puts on us. It's coming, whether you want it to or not, and I think the best chance we have to stay relevant is to be proactive, get involved. These organizations don't know about, or not the ones that are directly involved with fisheries, but the ones that are thinking about, you know, this our energy demands and basically the energy agencies. They don't care about us. They don't think about us. We're this sort of externality that, you know, they'd like to just roll past, and we can't let that happen. So I think ASMFC, the states, any opportunity we have to be involved, we need to take those opportunities because this is going to be a big deal. You know, we're in the throes of it up here in southern New England, have been for a while. I've got a few turbines off my coast here in Rhode Island. I think we need to be invested, involved in any way that they'll let us in to be honest. So just a couple of thoughts from me.
A couple of really good thoughts, Jason. Thank you for those. Eric Reed, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not on the committee. I'm happy to wait until you guys are done if you want.
No, happy to have you weigh in now, Eric.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Mr. Gilmore about you know, where we should be on mitigation and compensation. Those are two big four-letter words, and it's a really sticky issue. And you know, Mr. Anderson's point about divide and conquer. Well, that divide and conquer is the norm. That's how they get what they want. But you know, the comment about it's a coast-wide thing. You know, certainly all the turbines themselves are going to be in federal waters, but, you know, the extension cords, the export cables are going to have to come around somewhere. And it'll be in through a salt marsh near you. And that's something where ASMFC really, you know, would be able to comment with some authority. You know, the overarching issue is that as far as BOEM is concerned and the wind developers are concerned, NOAA, the National Marine Fisheries Service, the councils, and ASMFC, and even the Coast Guard, we're just advisors. And at this point, you know, they ask us for our opinion. I mean, I've been in I don't know how many meetings and everybody's in the room, but at the end of the day, it's like my wife asking me what color I want to paint the house. And you know how that goes. So they don't have to listen to us, but there was a discussion yesterday at the CCC about how improving the amount of traction we get in these meetings, and I think it's very important that ASMFC gets in that conversation, because it's going to be a problem, you know. And maybe the best or the worst example is from the South Fork Wind Farm, which is southeast of Montauk. One of those export cables is going to go 178 miles through Long Island Sound, and the environmental mess that's going to be is something that I think we really need to pay attention to. So those are just my thoughts. Thanks a lot, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate that. I've got John Clark, Dan McKernan, and Cherie Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Joe, for bringing this up. And I just wanted to reinforce what's been said already about coordination. I mean, we were just asked by our Coastal Zone program to comment on this draft Central Atlantic wind area, which stretches from Delaware down to North Carolina. And, you know, pretty much what Bill Anderson was saying there, want to make sure that what we're commenting on meshes with what Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina are also thinking on this. And it does seem that you're out there commenting on your own as a state. It would be helpful to coordinate all these comments so that we speak with one voice on these fisheries issues raised by the wind farms. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Dan McKernan.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. I agree with Jim Gilmore as well about the amount of time that these new initiatives are consuming, and I agree with Jay McNamee that it's here. And so I am in the process of trying to hire a full-time person just to pay attention to all of these wind issues. But it doesn't stop there, because then that person's going to have to turn around and talk to our habitat people and to our data folks. I think it would be appropriate for ASMFC to have a offshore wind development specialist just to attend so many of these meetings and report back and help coordinate the states and also speak to a lot of these data sets that exist, whether it be like the EVTRs and you know, the safest data, because so much of what gets negotiated over in some of these compensation packages is data that is being collected under the oversight of ASMFC and of course NIMS. I would you know, I would be in favor if it's at all possible in the future to add a staff person at ASMFC to help us with this and to help coordinate. So thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Cherie Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Dan. I think that, and others, I think that we are in a process that is going to be steamrolled with BOEM if we're not aware and in sync with each other. I think it's important that we stay ahead of this, or at least try and stay in parallel to the process. And in order to do that, we need to have some boots on the ground that's going to be able to be watchful. As we know, a lot of these offshore wind companies are heading right for like data portals that we know have data gaps and are making some broad-based decisions based on these data gaps, that I think it's so important for both NOAA Fisheries and ASMFC to be able to show where these gaps are and how these can affect both fisheries and habitats, both in federal and in state waters also. So I think that we need to stay ahead of this, or at least in line with it. Thanks.
Thanks, Cherie. Next on my list is Shanna Madsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I also want to recognize, like Eric did, I am not actually on this committee. So if there's anyone ahead of me that you'd like to take before me, I'm happy to wait.
No, go ahead, Shanna. You have the last hand right now.
Okay, great. I just want to say that I really agree with a lot of the comments that I've heard so far. Having worked for a state that was just getting started with wind over in New Jersey a few years ago, and now moving to Virginia and seeing us just getting started with wind has really kind of brought to light how important it is for us to collaborate on these things. You know, as soon as we started hiring someone here to start looking at the wind energy development offshore in Virginia, the first thing I said was, you know, start talking to some of our neighbor states, gathering information, lessons learned, and things like that, because it really exploded while I was in New Jersey. I hope you don't mind me speaking to that, Joe. And I can see it really exploding here as well. So like our previous commenters, I think it's really important for us to stay ahead of the game, work collaboratively, and kind of just all be on the same page here.
Great, thanks, Shannon. I don't see any additional hands. Certainly the comments have been strongly supportive of more coordination, with even the concept of having a staff person to help with that coordination and attend meetings. I think what I would do now, if it is the desire of the executive committee meeting, I can raise this in my committee report to the policy board at the end of the meeting. But I think based on these comments, I think we're going to need to take some time in an executive committee meeting to really think through how that engagement is going to look, whether we would consider adding staff at the commission level or utilize existing staff, which are already stretched fairly thin, obviously. So if there is no objections to that, I'll raise these comments today with the larger group, and then ask the new incoming chair to put this on the executive committee agenda in the near future as a priority for discussion. Does that sound all right? If I hear no comments, I'll take that as a positive. Hearing no comments, seeing no hands, we'll move in that direction. Thanks for bringing that forward, Joe, and thanks for the comments from everybody. We'll move now on to the next agenda item, which is to discuss the Seafood Processor Pandemic Response and Safety Block Grant Program. And I'm going to turn that over to Bob Beadle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of background here. I think most of the states know that the U.S. Department of Agriculture announced that there is $50 million in assistance available to seafood processing facilities and processing vessels through block grants that will go out to the state agencies. The state agencies have until, I believe it's November 22nd to apply for funding. But it's also my understanding that some states have already received funding through USDA, and I think this, Joe Cimino and I had a conversation about this, and the reason that this was added to the agenda was kind of a little bit of a round robin to see how the states are handling this. Sometimes there's really strong communication between USDA and state fishery agencies, and sometimes there's not. So it seems to be different strategies in different states. So I think it's, Pat, just a bit of a check-in and see, just to provide the opportunity for a few minutes of conversation amongst the states to decide if they want ASMFC to do anything, which I don't think is the case necessarily, but just to compare notes on where you are.
Great, thanks, Bob. Joe, I know you originally brought it up. You want to take the first crack at it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matt. This is different than CARES in a lot of ways, although we all had a ton of question about CARES, and it seemed like, NOAA was forced to interpret a lot of that, and that was kind of intense, right? And that part of it is the same. We have questions for USDA, and they're kind of like, we don't necessarily have answers. So it's tough. And you know, this is interesting. Janet Coit has been sending out emails about this. So there is a push from the fishery side of this, and it's a very different ball game on what we're going to tackle and what states are going to get. Unlike the formula used for CARES, 31 or 32 million out of the 50 million is going to Alaska on this. So other states are going to have much smaller programs to deal with, but they could have huge response. And there's stuff like market pivot. If a seafood processor comes to you and says that they switch to online marketing and they want money for it, you know, you're supposed to come up with this either as a fisheries agency or as an ag agency. And they even leave it up to the states who's going to apply. In New Jersey, it's going to be DEP, and I'm going to be dealing with these applications. So I thought that if we could carve out some time at a few executive committee meetings, I know we won't have many before the applications are due. Bob was right. That's 11/22. They're due in. But just to get some ideas of what other people are thinking and how other states are trying to tackle this, it would be helpful.
I got a few hands popping up. We'll start with Jim Gilmore. Go ahead, Jim.
Thanks, Chairman. Yeah, this is just a quick thing. At one point, I think that's going to be relevant is how much each state is getting. I was talking to Pat Gear last week, and I believe Virginia was getting in, 7 figures. It was getting $1 million. New York's getting 200,000, and I have over 200 eligible recipients. So I'm sitting here looking at CARES, is millions of dollars. It's worth the effort. It's going to cost me more to get $200,000 out the door than it is to really much of a benefit. So what we're hoping to do in New York with that pittance is essentially waive all of our dealers have to get seafood guys, whatever, have to get permits every year. So we want to just put it into an account and waive all the permit fees for next year, and hopefully that'll take away a lot of the administrative burden. Because with CARES, we had the commission to cut the checks and all that stuff. I don't think we have the same opportunity here. So, but if other states have a lot more money, then it's understandable there might be more involvement they're going to be. But any of the states that just got a few bucks, I'm either doing that or I'm trying to get our Ag and Markets agency to administer it, so they have the headache of cutting checks, not me. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Jim. Next on the list is Chris Batsavich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. North Carolina, we're still talking with our agricultural department as far as who's going to handle this. I think, like Jim, I don't think we're getting a whole lot of money from this block grant. I guess a comment and a question. One, how this was rolled out was kind of odd. I guess they had an email list. USDA had an email list, for all the state reps, and unfortunately went to I think a retired state director for North Carolina. So once we realized that folks who handle this kind of stuff for our agency weren't getting stuff, we're kind of a little behind to start off with. But a question that I guess wasn't clear to D. Lupton and I is what exactly how do they define a seafood processor? Obviously it's not the fish house, it's offloaded, but is it a crab picking facility, oyster shucking, or is it something bigger than that, like what we see in other states? I think that would just kind of help in terms of if we end up being the agency that has to administer this program. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Chris. Jason McNamee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's funny. I'm basically going to echo everything that Jim Gilmore just said. I think it's a very small amount of money coming into Rhode Island. One of the things we were thinking about is exactly what Jim said, this notion of because it's such a small amount of money, how about we just don't make them, pay for their license next year? Simple, benefit to everybody, less paperwork, and all that good stuff. Our understanding, based on, they just had a webinar pretty recently, and based on that webinar, we weren't thinking that was going to be an option, but hearing Jim bring it up, maybe there is still some life in that idea. But just like Chris said, we kind of became aware of it. Rhode Island is small, and we're all kind of integrated because we have to be here. And so luckily I was in communication with the head of our agriculture division. And so that's how we started to hear about it. We also have a seafood marketing collaborative, and it kind of popped up in that venue as well. So I would just encourage other states to check in with their, in particular, their ag department for two reasons. They're the ones that probably have heard about it the most at this point, and they are the ones that can probably help you in dealing with USDA because they have lots of experience doing that. But yeah, it's pretty much the same group we had working on CARES Act. We're going to have work on this, and I'm not sure I see a rule for, just to answer Bob's question directly, I don't see a rule for ASMFC here, but we're kind of, even though it's short to get the application in, we're pretty early in the process for trying to figure this out. So I might be coming back with my hat in my hand later, but right now I don't see that it's going to interact with ASMFC. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason. Mel Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, similar to what others have already noted, I will say that we were very fortunate that after that first phone call that a number of us were on, our state ag folks reached out to me. Of course, they were thinking, well, you guys have got this. And I explained that we don't do block grants. And anyway, long story short, our state ag folks have been very helpful and are actually, since they do this sort of thing all the time, I have Chris McDonough, who handled all of our CARES activities, is basically working with a rep from ag. And they've had several meetings, obviously, and have trying to figure out the question about what is a dealer. Well, that came up in the very first meeting. What is a dealer? And we have some folks who meet that qualification. Chris, if you, Chris Bat Savage, if you want to get what we've picked up on, maybe Chris McDonough could help you with that at some point if you want to contact us. But we've got a pretty good idea of what a dealer is and what a dealer isn't, at least in our case. But we're hoping to try to do something. I don't see a role for ASMFC, honestly, like CARES, because this really isn't like CARES, as Joe said. It's so we're going to give it a try, and we may be able to help a few folks, but they are pretty restrictive in what they will actually fund, and they're not funding revenue replacement like CARES sort of did. But we're going to give it a shot. But for us, USDA was the key. If our state USDA folks hadn't agreed to help us out, we'd have really been lost, because we don't really have the capacity to do the things that you need to do to manage a block grant. And we're still, of course, tapping staff, as we've all noticed with CARES. It's a big requirement to put on existing staff in our case.
Great, thanks, Mel. I've got a few more hands up. I'm going to go to Pat Gear, then Dan McKernan, Bill Anderson, and then back to Joe Semino. So Pat Gear. On mute, Pat. still on mute, Pat. There you go.
It keeps bouncing back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been on these calls since they started, and I think the first couple of calls that we were on, it was all of us. It was all the folks that were dealing with the CARES Act for the last 18 months. They said they invited the ag departments, but nobody showed up. I don't know if that's the case or not. Our seafood board reached out to us, and we kind of took the attitude, look, we've done this twice already for disaster relief. We know the players, and maybe best that we do it. So we're pursuing that moving forward. And as everyone said, it's very specific on what it's for expenses dealing with, COVID-19. It's not a disaster relief. So, and there's a lot of questions. I mean, it's during the calls when we've asked questions of USDA, they just, you could tell they weren't ready for those kind of questions. So, I mean, a lot of us have been doing this for a year and a half now, and we just thought it was a logical thing for us to move forward and do it. And any ideas we can bounce off of each other, that would be greatly appreciated.
Great, thanks, Pat. Dan McKernan.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. I actually do see a role for ASMFC here, even if it's just informal. The calls that we had with Kelly Dennett, as we were all wrestling with some of the CARES questions, I thought were beneficial. And what Joe asked for at the beginning of this conversation was an opportunity to compare notes and compare strategies over the next 3 or 4 weeks while we put our plans together. I think there is a role there if ASMFC could convene maybe a follow-up call with the USDA representative. Maybe we could start out the call by by having them present one more time, and then if they get off the call or stay on the call, then we could all come brainstorm and come up with smart ways to do this. In Massachusetts, we require anybody who's receiving seafood for commercial purposes to hold a dealer permit. So that even includes like supermarkets, but it's not an entity that's regulated by us. It's actually regulated more by our Department of Public Health. Because we co-permit those. So they are our stakeholders, and they are within our permitting control. So we're the logical ones to be administering this grant. So I would ask if folks agree that maybe we could make an executive committee like call, put it together. I'd bring like maybe some of my staff who are going to do this grant, and we could compare notes with Joe's staff or anybody else who wants to join.
Okay, thanks, Dan. We'll come back to that idea. I've got Bill Anderson.
Thank you, Pat. We unfortunately find ourselves in the spirit of comparing notes. We unfortunately find ourselves with a chunk of change that is much closer to what New York is getting than Virginia is getting, regrettably. So, as per the comments before, there's going to be a lot of effort to move a relatively small amount of money out the door. Fortunately for us, Maryland Department of Agriculture has the lead here, but my team is coordinating with them. And I just wanted to kind of pile on a comment that Chris made earlier about qualification. The interesting thing, and we've actually asked the USDA for clarification about a week ago, and I hope we get it soon. And I'll share it through Bob if we get it back, get clarification back. But through the pandemic, at least we have found many of our traditional watermen moving farther along in the supply chain, filleting, bagging, selling at retail, what have you. So it appears that some of those folks might actually qualify. And some of the investments they're making are clearly related to safety as a retailer. Or at least in the wholesale side of the business. So I think our challenge is going to be that expanded population of people who might qualify for money to come out of this block grant, and clarification from USDA as to how far that definition goes. So again, if we get clarification, Bob, I'll send it to you, and we can share it with the group. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Bill. We spent a bunch of time on this topic, and I've got some ideas on moving forward, but I'll take Joe Cimino as the last comment and then see if we can't wrap this up.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. It's real easy. Dan covered everything I wanted to say.
Okay, perfect. Well done, Dan. So there's definitely a mix here of, I think, states that need some help with some coordination and not. I'm not sure this rises to necessarily the level of an executive committee meeting, but at the very least, the idea of asking which states may want to be on a call and see if we can't organize that from the staff level, and maybe the director could reach out to USDA. I know here in Maine we're not getting near the funds that we expected to get. We're working with our ag sister agency, who is going to actually apply for a single block grant, and then we'll distribute the $800,000 that is part of the seafood equation. The only difference is I've got another 10 million from ARC money that is for very similar use. So we're able to roll that money into a bigger pot and make it worthwhile, because if it was not, if we didn't have that, it would have been very different here, I think, on how we would approach it in Maine. So, Bob, are you, the good soldier that you are you willing to host a call and see if we can't get USDA to talk to states who would like to participate?
Yeah, absolutely. I can reach out to USDA and see if they're available. I guess, the first question, though, is back to yours, Pat, which is how many states are interested? If it's really only a couple, that, maybe that's easier to coordinate and we can handle that maybe differently. But if it's, a considerable number, then I'll need to check schedules and do things a little bit differently. So happy to organize it, but maybe step one would be if the states could just shoot me an email and say, yeah, I would like to participate, if we could set something up.
Well, maybe we could do it a little bit quicker, just to give you a quick number here. The states that would like to participate, can you just hit your button to raise your hand? 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, that's more than I thought. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We've got 8 states right now that are looking to want to participate. If that helps you, Bob, a little bit, it sounds like you're probably going to have to kind of do some scheduling as well. So,
yeah, that sounds good. I'll get started on it and see what windows the USDA folks may have available. And then, it sounds like doing it sooner rather than later is helpful, because the 22nd of November is going to be here before you know it.
yeah, I mean, once you schedule it, you're probably going to have more states that are going to want to jump on just to listen. But I think we can at least help a little bit with coordination from that standpoint, and then states can kind of take it from there probably. Okay, good.
One quick thing, Pat, if that's okay. And to Dan McKiernan's point, I assume the call will be open to anyone else in the states that are associated with this USDA project. The CARES Act, we kind of opened that up, and the coordinator for CARES were involved in a lot of the executive committee discussions. So I assume that's okay with everyone as well.
Yeah, I think that's the best approach. I mean, we're all at that higher level, but the staff that are going to be in the weeds are going to need to participate, I would think. So, okay, another good discussion on that regarding the block grant. So let's move on. We've got a few more agenda items here. The next item is to discuss the appeals process. I'm going to go right back to our director.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Everyone's favorite topic, the appeals process. So the executive committee has chatted about this a couple times. And at the end of the briefing materials that were sent out prior to this meeting, the last few pages are a document that is titled Considerations for Updating the Appeals Process. The executive committee has looked through this document, or I've quickly gone through it once with the executive committee, and it hasn't changed a whole lot since then. And then at the very end, there's some language and some thoughts provided by John Clark on a subject that I'll talk about toward the end of this. But quickly to rerun through the document on considerations for updating the appeals process. As everyone knows, the New York black sea bass appeal was sort of the first time we fully tested the appeals process. We had some appeals in the past, but they've been worked out prior to the management board being obligated to take action and actually implement management changes. But in the New York black sea bass appeal, it went all the way through the management board. The management board took action to respond to the policy board directive, and the allocations for black sea bass are modified. During or following that appeal from New York, a couple questions or a few questions have been raised, and it was talked about at the policy board meeting on August 5th. And at the beginning of this document, the 3 questions are spelled out there, but I'll quickly go over them. And the first question is, what happens if the species board's unable to take action to satisfy the direction from the policy board? So if you get to the species management board and then they, for whatever reason, there's just a stalemate, or there's just an inability to move forward, what happens? And then the second question was, should we make the timeline a little bit more flexible to allow for additional analysis or other technical work to help out the species management board so they can respond to the direction from the policy board? Some folks had indicated maybe some additional analysis or additional thought on options and sort of impacts would have been helpful in black sea bass, and maybe moving forward would be helpful as well. And then the third question that came up was, is it appropriate for the policy board to weigh in on allocation or reallocation when a decision is made by a species management board? And that management board obviously is comprised of the affected states for any allocation questions. So staff put together this document. Again, it's not really recommendations from staff. These are just, if the board or if the policy board felt that you guys wanted to respond and modify the appeals process, here's some ideas on potential ways to do that. So just moving through the document, if you move forward to the 3rd page, about halfway down, there's a list of items that says the following issues cannot be appealed. In order to address question number 3, which is the idea of should the policy board be should the policy board weigh in on allocation reallocation? If the policy board, or if there was a decision to say the policy board should not be involved in allocation, we could add item number 4 to this list, which is allocation is not something that can be appealed. So whatever that would mean, that whatever the decision by a management board is final, and no additional action by a state can be appealed and brought back to the policy board and or species board for reconsideration. So that's addressing the question number 3. If you move forward through the document and you look at the bottom of page 4, there's some a parenthetical that says to address questions 1 and 2 above. And the following bit of language there is, the few bullets there are options or potential language that could be included to address questions number 1 and 2. Item number 1, if a management board is unable to make the changes necessary to respond to the findings of the policy board, we could try some of these options. The management board can request clarification from the policy board to be more specific on what they need to address. The policy board meeting can be scheduled to clarify and respond to the management board's request at the next quarterly meeting. The second idea could be that the management board can inform the policy board that's unable to address the findings, and the policy board then could take action and approve changes. So the management board ends up with a stalemate, it bounces back to the policy board, and then the policy board would take action under that option. And then the final one is the management board can request additional analysis and provide additional background, and they could tap into the management and science committee, assessment science committee, or whoever really could help them out. And then that would extend the timeline of the appeal, obviously, because we'll need to provide those technical groups some time to do some work. So these aren't really mutually exclusive options. Some of them can be combined, and or all 3 of them can be added to the document if that's the choice of the group. And then at the very last, at the very end of the document on page 6, about halfway down, there's a note that this timeline can remain unchanged, or we can add details about timing of management board meetings and that sort of thing. Because really, it ends right now with the policy board taking action and having 15 days, or a summary of the policy board meeting will be sent out within 15 days of the conclusion of the meeting. So we can add some more detail for all the subsequent steps of bouncing it back to the management board and potential future technical work. So that's the document itself. And then looking into the document that John Clark provided, and he can obviously provide more details on this, is John Clark and Joe Cimino have both brought up the notion that, you know, they feel that we need to work within the management options that were brought out for public comment. And if you look at the language that John put together, and he you know, did some analysis on the background and policy board meetings and guiding documents and those sorts of things. But the highlighted yellow text is essentially a suggestion from John on language that could be included. And it says, if the policy board requires that the management board takes specific correction action, these corrective actions must be limited to the management options as written in the draft amendment or addendum reviewed by the public. So, you know, just sort of a very direct statement that says you have to work within the bounds of the document and options that were taken out for public comment. So those are the ideas that have come up, Mr. Chair, during the discussion, and just some staff responses or potential staff responses of modifications that could be implemented in the process document if the executive committee chooses to do that. And I think, again, since this is a full policy of the commission, is really just a initial conversation here at the executive committee, which would be balanced to the policy board. The policy board would be the group that takes final action on modifying the appeals process.
Great, thanks, Bob. There is a fair amount here to consider. I'm not sure if the executive committee at this time is ready to make a final decision on advancing anything to the policy board. But let's open up let's open it up to questions and comments and see where we end up. Any hands? I'm not seeing any hand. Oh, well, there's a hand. Dan McKernan.
Thanks. I'll give it a shot. So on numerous occasions over the last few years, I've raised the issue to the commission about the need for like an arbitration, almost some independent assessment of allocation issues. I've often referenced what I learned about the British Columbia groundfish fishery, where they actually brought in a retired Supreme Court justice to devise the scheme, and it had to be accepted in its entirety, up or down, and that's how they worked out those very difficult allocation questions. We'll never get that. But in my view, the policy board, because it will include many states that aren't on the management board, is a close cousin to that, because you have states who will ponder these questions, and I hope and I suspect will be reasonable and somewhat neutral on some of these allocation questions. And so I really like the system as designed now, where the policy board can look over the shoulder of the species management board and make such a ruling. And as far as John Clark's suggestions go, you know, while we're not opposed to it, I don't think we should be limited to just the exact options that might have been in a proposed, you know, management plan. But I think within the range is certainly reasonable. But I would want it to be have a little more flexibility as far as what the management board might be able to do.
Great, thanks, Dan. A couple more hands up. I've got Jim Gilmore, Spud Woodward, and John Clark.
Thanks, Chairman. And let me tiptoe around this because it was New York that brought this up, but I'm trying to get back to the 60,000 foot level and look at. So some of the issues that I think we'll have to deal with is a bigger issue that came out of this appeal, was that it was a states' rights issue. And I think the problem that we still need to struggle with, and I'll agree, if New York had to give up quota under allocations or whatever, we'd be reluctant to do it just because of going back home. So I guess the suggestion of taking allocation out as one of the things that couldn't be appealed, I'd be opposed to at this point, because we don't have another mechanism to actually address that issue. And having dealt with some lawsuits over the years, the next step would be that. I mean, if there's essentially a state feels aggrieved and there's no way the commission can handle it, then it's going to go to, it's out of ASMFC's hands, and it'll go to, you know, a court or whatever, which I am strongly believe, and I hope everybody agrees, that we should be resolving this. The other thing too, in some of the court cases that we've been involved with over the years, the judges tend to remand it back to the management organization and say, well, they should exhaust all processes or administrative processes. So at this point, I'm kind of okay. I like the improvements that have been suggested because it clarifies a whole lot of things. But taking allocations out, which is going to be a big issue, whether we like it or not, there's just going to be more and more things shifting. I would suggest we leave in for now, but we really need to get at that bigger issue. If we're going to have whole populations shifting around up and down the coast, we're just going to be seeing more and more arguments over allocations, which are not going to get solved at the board level. So, thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Spud Woodward.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. Yeah, I'll echo what Jim just said. I don't believe that allocation-based appeals should be out of bounds. I think that it may be troubling sometimes to have what may be perceived as disinterested parties sitting in the jury. I think that's one of the strengths of the commission, is that sometimes, we can look at things maybe a little less passionately and
What just happened?
Pat, you might be on mute.
Something odd is going on because my mic went away for a while.
Tina, you can hear me?
I can. I can't. Spud went out early.
So I just got a text from Pat that he dropped off. So Tina, can you see the list of hands? Maybe we can just keep going down that and Pat will log back in.
I see Spud still has his hand up, so.
Oh, you guys are back. Can you hear me, Tina?
Yes.
My computer just went down. I can hear you, but I can't see the dashboard here. I'm trying to restore everything. Okay. There we go. You can hear me now. So I'm gonna call on John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree that allocation should stay in as an appealable situation. In fact, Delaware did appeal allocation back with addendum 4 to the striped pass plan, but I just wanted to bring up the points I made about following what goes out to the public. I think it's more than just following that for the sake of that's what we presented. I think it actually does start straying into actual legal ramifications for not following what has been taken out to public hearing because of the way we've written the ISFMP guidelines. So I think that is an issue that we should be aware of there. And also just from the standpoint that we're always hearing from the advisory panels that the boards ignore everything they say. In this case, we take a document out for public hearing and then we come back and come up with an option that the public has never seen. I think it just makes everything look ridiculous. And, you know, if you're part of the public and you already think that ASMFC doesn't listen to you, and then something like this happens, you know, it just further reinforces the idea that the board's going to do whatever the board's going to do. It's all political, and no matter what they present to the public, they could change it at any time. I think we do have to be much more careful with that. As I said, anybody who has to develop regulations in their state knows that that's, if you try to change anything after you've gone to public hearing, you've got to go to another public hearing to do that. So I just want us to be aware that when we say we're taking something to public hearing, that is what the Thank you.
Thanks, John. I think you're bringing up a really valid point. I know if here within the state of Maine, if we are making major substantive changes to a rule that has gone out to public, we have to go back to the public. So I think we need to really keep an eye on that portion of the document and take into account the draft document that went out, public comments that have been raised, and not go outside of those bounds. And if we do have to go outside of those bounds, then we really should strongly consider potentially even another round of public comment. So I don't have any more hands showing right now. I don't believe we're ready to make any final decisions on the draft that has been submitted by staff. I think we've got some more work to do, but let's see if Bob can help give us some clarity, and then I'll take a couple more comments. Bob? You're on mute, Bob.
Yeah, talking to myself again. Sorry. I was going to agree with your last statement, which is staff has a little more work to do, Pat. The one thing that everyone has agreed with, or no one's disagreed with, is that allocation should be an appealable dimension in this appeals process. It doesn't sound like people want to make allocation out of bounds. So we can, that part's easy to address. And I think, Spud commented that the other ideas in here have merit. We need maybe to refine the language a little bit. So I would suggest staff goes back and does that. We'll put together a document that, directly weaves language into the document. We can highlight that and so everyone can see what the new language is and bring a very transparent document back on what's changed at the next meeting if folks are comfortable with that.
Yeah, I think that's the right approach. There's two additional new hands that have come up. I'm ready to wrap this item up, but I'll take a couple very quick comments from Roy Miller and then Tom Fody. Roy, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you. I was muted by the organizer temporarily. I just wanted to say that the phrase within the range of the values in the hearing documents seems to be the troublesome phrase, and we should give some attention to exactly what that means. So, for instance, if you have a 1% exceedance or a 5%, and it turns out that it's 3%, does that become appealable? So pay some attention to within the range, because that seems to come up repeatedly in our appeal process. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Roy. I'm going to wrap this up, but Tom, I'm going to give you a quick last word here, please.
Yeah, I think is board meetings where we basically completely ignored where we went out of public hearings. That was years ago. I don't think we do that often anymore, but I understand why we should really look at that. But we again need a range, because as we sit around the table, we find out better methods than going to what went out to public hearings.
Great, thanks, Tom. So we'll have a cleaned up document revised by staff, and we will take this up at one of the next executive committee meetings. So that was good discussion, a lot of good comments on that. I appreciate that as well. Next item on the agenda is the future annual meetings update. Laura, are we going to have a future annual meeting?
That's the best question that you've asked this morning, Mr. Chair. So in my world, yes. I don't know if in the real world we will. But if we are to have future annual in-person meetings, in 2022, we will be in New Jersey. In 2023, we'll be in Beaufort, North Carolina. And in 2024, we'll be in Maryland, 2025 Delaware. So that is my report, Mr. Chair.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Any questions for Laura on those dates? Seeing none. Is there any other business? Oh, John Clark's hand went up. John?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just quickly, Laura, is there any chance that the winter meeting will be an in-person meeting, or the annual meeting in New Jersey be in winter, or are we back to next fall?
I believe we're back to next fall, but I would defer to my executive director to fully answer that question.
Is it okay if I chime in?
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I guess all of that, the answer is I hope so, John. The idea is hopefully, if COVID cooperates, we'll be meeting in the last week of January in Arlington at the same hotel that we've been meeting in pre-COVID, and then the annual meeting in 2022, as Laura mentioned, will be in New Jersey. Most likely, or in all likelihood, not at the same hotel that we have not been able to work things out with for the past couple of years. So, the location's still a little bit up in the air, but we're considering the Galloway Hotel in Galloway, New Jersey, that we've met 16 or 17 years ago now, that we've had a gap in our annual meeting schedule. But it was a nice hotel and big enough to accommodate us. So that's what we're thinking. The one variable, I guess, is during COVID, we had a number of executive committee discussions on should one meeting a year be virtual or something along those lines. And that's something we'll need to sort out sooner rather than later, so we can ask Laura how to handle things at the Westin in Arlington. So, for example, should we meet, if everything works out well, should we meet in person in January and May in Arlington, and then have the August meeting virtual, and then the annual meeting in person in New Jersey? That's one scenario. Or should we just do all of 2022 in person, because we haven't done much of it lately, just to reacquaint ourselves with each other? Those are all viable things, and I don't think we necessarily have to solve all of that today, but something that we need to probably tackle at an upcoming executive committee sooner rather than later.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Hopefully we're going to see some changes in the severity of the infection rates with the Delta variant, and we will be able to come together in January. So a lot to discuss between now and then, certainly.
Mr. Chair, if I might?
Yes, please.
I actually believe that we have to make the decision on the in-person meeting in Arlington this week, because I've got a contract proposal from the hotel. I have not signed it, and I have not committed to it, but we have to tell them something this week before we lose the space.
Okay. Well, so we do have a decision point here that we need to make. The last time we had a conversation around this issue, we certainly, through a survey results, had a lot of people who are willing to participate in a face-to-face meeting for the annual meeting. But when we came together to talk through it, we ended up delaying. Things have changed again a lot since that last conversation where we voted to delay the annual meeting. Are people in a different place now? Are people ready to make that call so Laura can sign the contract? Or are people feeling like January is still too early? Richie White.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just having trouble with the mute button. My question would be, how much money do we risk in the deposit if we go ahead and say yes, and then things don't turn out as well as we thought, and we have to cancel? So that would be one question. The second would be, depending on how things look, is how will the commission deal with masks and vaccinations? And that's another thing I think that would have to be decided. Thank you.
Yeah, all really good questions. Your first question, Laura, do you have a quick answer on that one?
No, I don't. We're within the 90-day almost window of cancellation, so the penalty would be pretty high.
Yeah.
So I do not have a dollar figure for you right now.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And I think those last two questions, Richie, are ones that the executive committee is going to have to struggle with as far as mask and vaccination rates. I know I personally would like to see a requirement for vaccination rates to attend, but we also have to then make a determination: are we going to have these open to the public as well, or are we going to meet real time but have public virtual? So another thing we're going to have to wrestle with. John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You just kind of hit on it. I was just going to ask Laura whether the hotel is fully set up for hybrid meetings. So, you know, I know that technology has been disappointing in the past year, but it has been coming along. Do you think it's something where it could be a hybrid meeting where even if we do meet in person, people that are concerned about it can join the meeting from their office or home and be fully part of the meeting?
Yes, I do think that they're prepared for that.
I've got Roy Miller and then Jim Gilmore and Spud Woodward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very quickly, I'm just wondering if the full commission or policy board should weigh in on subject as potentially controversial as masks and vaccination requirements, rather than just have the decision be made by the executive committee. Thank you.
Thanks, Roy. I think, you know, we're going to have to update the full commission on any decisions we make. So I think we'll have time to receive some comments on those things at that time for certain. So I'll go to Jim Gilmore and then Spud.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I would vote for the hybrid approach. We've been doing those at our local council meetings the last couple. Obviously, they're smaller, but we've been able to do it where we have the council members that want to come to the meeting participate in person, and then they're prioritized, the ones that don't come in person, through their video or whatever, and then the public are in a separate tier, so they just can't weigh in, and it's worked relatively well. So if we could do that, I think that might be not only a good way to go, but also a good test for the future to see how well this works. Thanks.
Yeah, I think those are really good comments, Jim. I've been thinking about that. I mean, there's always going to be a risk associated with COVID. If there's a way that we can ensure that we can maintain transparency and then receive good public comment, but still be at the table. It's no secret to everybody. We've got 3 big decision points coming up this winter between striped bass, menhaden, and lobster. So, you know, my feeling is a face-to-face meeting would be good. But I think leaning in the direction of hybrid would certainly be my preference. But let's go to Spud and then Bill Hyatt.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. Yeah, I would recommend that we go ahead and commit to an in-person meeting, recognizing that there is some capacity there for a hybrid format. And, you know, it's going to be challenging to find consensus on safety procedures and protocols. You know, everybody has their own perspective on it. I think it's certainly worth having a discussion. But, you know, I think it's important that we take the necessary steps to start re-engaging. I mean, we've been isolated from each other for almost 2 years now, and it is time to re-engage, and everybody's going to have to make their own sort of risk management choices. But I think it's time for us to try to move ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Bud. Bill Hyatt.
Thank you, Pat. I just have a question. How does a hybrid meeting work with regard to the contracts with the hotel? You know, I could foresee a circumstance where things change with COVID over time, get near to the hotel, and the number of attendees, people choosing to attend in person, changes markedly as you get close. I'm intrigued. I think it is worth trying, but I'm just curious as to how that all works financially with the host hotel.
Laura, do you have an answer for that?
Well, I mean, I'm certainly going to try and write into the contract some kind of a COVID clause, but it all depends on the hotel. If they have enough business that they don't need us, they're not going to go with it. But I'll do my best. And there are the North Carolina, the Beaufort Hotel actually has a COVID clause in that contract. I've not signed that one obviously either, but you know, I'll certainly look into that and see if I can get the same thing. The Westin has treated us very, very well, so I know that they'll work with us. They like us, but they're also in business to make money, so we have to understand that too.
Okay. Well, there's a risk in everything we do around COVID. So based on the comments, I would recommend that we have Laura sign the contract and we plan for an in-person hybrid meeting in January. Is there, I see one more hand coming up, but they'll ask for any objections to moving forward in that direction. Dennis Abbott? Dennis, you're on mute.
Thank you. I couldn't unmute myself. I'm in favor of going along with an in-person meeting, but I think we would have to work out the details, as other people have mentioned, about having an audience or whatever. I think we can set our own requirements for the board members, commission members, but if we were having striped bass meeting, contentious meetings, and we really don't know who's apt to want to come through the door. So I think the hybrid approach and keeping the meeting room, you know, to the commission members is an important thing to do at this point in time.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. I don't have any more hands up, so unless I hear an objection, we will let the full policy board know that we will be planning for an in-person meeting at the end of January. And at this time, I will let them know that the executive committee is going to continue to work out the details of a quote hybrid meeting, and that there'll have to be some additional conversations with the executive committee on masking and vaccinations. And then from that point, probably leave that question hanging with the policy board to, as Roy said, to receive some additional comments from others who are not on the policy board meeting. Any objections to proceeding in that direction? Hearing no objections, I'll move to the last agenda item, which is other business. Is there any other business to be brought before the executive committee? Seeing no hands, we will adjourn at 9:41. And the next, I believe the next meeting is at 10:30, which is Coastal Sharks. Assuming, Bob, you'll start that meeting at 10:30 as scheduled.
Yes, 10:30. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate the time. Those were good conversations on a lot of big topics. So good progress. Thank you very much. The meeting stands adjourned.